Boomerang Bomber by L. Ron Hubbard.
Ahoy down there.
Bellowed Clint Ragen into the gaping hold.
What are you doing with that bomber?
The blotchy-faced second officer glanced up, shrugged, and turned to direct the hoisting of a large box. The winch started slowly, went faster, and then, like a projectile, the box swooped over and thumped on the biggest concrete dock in Kobe, Japan. Clint Ragen swore loudly and whirled to run up the ladder to the bridge. The liner's captain was waiting, evidently with prepared answers.
What's the idea? You can't land that plane here. Look, I've paid freight all the way to Shanghai.
The captain shrugged immaculate blue-clad shoulders.
I'm not delaying my ship just for one piece of freight, Mr. Ragen. And although I realize that you should have been notified of this sooner,
Come to the point.
just this. The Japanese have branded your bomber as being contraband of war, and we cannot sail unless we unload it immediately.
Contraband of war?
Clint stared wide-eyed at the dock.
But they can't do...
The appearance of a small, frock-coated, gray-haired American stopped Clint's flow of words. Clint recognized Professor Alan Simpson, late of Kansas City, and a fellow passenger.
My dear fellow, I would strongly advise your going down there to supervise that unloading. I saw the first crate splinter on the side.
Simpson pointed with his umbrella and nodded, as though satisfied that he had done his duty. Clint Ragen whirled on the captain again.
Damn it, man. You can't pitch that plane off here. Do you know that it's worth $70,000? If I don't deliver it to the nationalist government, I'll be fired. I'm responsible for it, and so are you. It's in your care as freight.
Sue, if you want to,
Said the captain wearily.
it would cost more than that to hold this boat up any longer. I'm already behind schedule. You better see the Japanese authorities.
Clint took a deep breath and glared. His fists clenched and unclenched below the lower edge of his white jacket. Suddenly, he yanked his Panama hat over his eyes and ran for the gangway.
Those crates marked engine.
Began Professor Simpson before he realized that the pilot had gone. He turned to say something to the captain and found that he, too, had departed in all his gold braid magnificence. Professor Simpson lifted off his tinted glasses, wiped them, and moved to the rail. Clint Ragen was trying his best to prevent damage to his expensive charge. The plane was crated in sections which were now being strewn aimlessly about on the concrete. Men stood by listlessly watching the performance, quite willing to lend a hand, but not knowing where to start. The pilot bawled at them in English, but they shook their heads, raised their eyebrows, and remained standing idle. Professor Simpson shouted something in a reedy voice, and the men glanced up. At another shout, they went busily to work, piling the crates neatly under the eaves of the shed. Clint Ragen stood still in surprise and stared at the old man who had worked the magic.
If you speak this lingo...
I'll come down.
Said Professor Simpson.
The guard is coming, and I doubt if any of them will be able to speak English or Chinese.
He went carefully down the slanted gangway and came to a stop beside the pilot. Deliberately, he wiped his glasses, replaced them, and stared around him. The last box swooped dockward in a net to be deftly caught and placed with the others. Then the guard came up and clanked rifle butts to the concrete. The officer in charge was smartly uniformed. His leather shone and his bristly hair stood straight up into his pillbox cap. A small pair of wings graced his chest. The officer spoke rapidly to Clint, and when he had finished, the professor translated.
He says that this bombing airplane is contraband of war and has been seized by the Japanese government. He wants to know if you are the owner.
Clint stepped back and compressed his lips, his fists working.
Tell him I am the man who is responsible for the safe delivery of this bomber. and tell him that the U.S. will raise merry hell with the rising sun if anything happens to said U.S. property.
The professor spoke and received an answer from the officer.
You are in error.
Simpson told Clint.
This bomber is intended for the Chinese government and is therefore war contraband. It is all very simple, Mr. Ragen. You have no alternative but to board the liner and leave your airplane here.
What? No. Go away and leave $70,000 worth of airplane? Why, my company would kill me in cold blood. Do you realize that? Oh, hell. Can't let myself be marooned here in Japan. And I've got to deliver that plane if I have to fight the whole Japanese army. Tell him that and ask him how in the hell they knew it was aboard anyway.
Professor Simpson, with quite a bit of editing, translated the message, and the Japanese flying officer became very stiff and stern. He frowned, but before he could open his mouth to speak, a whistle blasted above them, drowning out all other sound. Clint Ragen moved one step forward and then stopped. It was no use now. The liner was already 30 feet away from the pier and retreating faster every moment. The captain, afraid for his ship and cargo, had not waited, knowing that the outcome could be in only one side's favor, the Japanese. The slight gray-haired Simpson stood and trembled violently. Words quivered in his throat but were never uttered. Professor Simpson knew that he had been marooned without baggage or passport. Slowly the professor turned his lined face to Clint.
My passport, my baggage. Oh, I will arrive in Shanghai too late to join my Gobi expedition. I'm a ruined man, Mr. Ragen.
Clint Ragen, though worried over his own troubles, was instantly sympathetic.
I'm sorry about that. It was I who brought you down here. Look, see here, Simpson. Look, I've got some money with me, and you're welcome to as much of it that you need. Look, they won't raise the devil with you for not having a passport. Not you, they won't. Like, I always carry mine right with me.
I forgot mine.
He patted a binocular case on his hip and hefted his black folded umbrella.
These are all the baggage that I have.
The pilot pushed a $20 bill in Simpson's hand and sighed deeply.
Look, tell this monkey to take me to some officials. I want to talk with somebody high up, and I want to see the U.S. ambassador.
Simpson jabbered rapidly, listening closely, and then said,
You cannot communicate with your ambassador because he's not available. The only officials to whom you may speak are the high officers of the Air Force. I would suggest that you...
Tell him to take me to that outfit and tell them to post a guard over these crates. We'll find out whether or not a bomber is contraband.
Baron Suga sat high upon a raised platform and studied the Americans who had been brought in before the impromptu court. He saw that one of the foreigners was tall, blonde, dressed in a soiled suit and Panama hat. From this man's bearing, the Japanese officer knew that he had here a military personality. Of the other foreigner, the Baron understood that he must be one of great learning and dignity. Looking up, Clint Ragen understood in his turn that something was about to go hard with him. In the polished faces he saw neither mercy nor compromise. Nevertheless, his lean features bore a somewhat insolent expression. Clint Ragen considered himself quite up to any situation which might arise, and in spite of the braid on the Baron's uniform. Clint Ragen knew he faced only a man. Baron Suga leaned forward and spoke in clipped English.
Your name is Ragen? You are a pilot. You were formerly a captain in the United States Army Air Service. You intend to deliver a bomber to the Chinese and then fly it for them.
Some of the insolence went out of the pilot's face. His sea-blue eyes shifted warily, and he thought to himself that Japanese intelligence must be very thorough to know all that about one man.
The bomber is, according to an ultimatum issued recently, contraband of war. Your act in delivering it to the Chinese may be regarded, for our purposes, as unfriendly. Why did you not accept it as such and proceed with your vessel?
Clint Ragen shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets and shifted his weight to his right foot.
Because said vessel ran off and left us.
And this man with you?
Said the Baron, bowing respectfully toward Professor Simpson.
Why did he find it necessary to accompany you before this aviation board?
Because my ship left me.
Stated Simpson, removing his glasses and wiping them, squinting his eyes the while.
I know nothing of Japan. I have no friends here.
And yet, you speak Japanese?
I learned it in Kansas. I had a servant boy who was Japanese, and he taught me. I always learn what presents itself to me for consideration.
A young flying officer leaned toward the Baron and whispered in his ear. Then the Baron bowed to Professor Simpson.
My apologies for my suspicion. You are from Kansas, then?
Clint Ragen walked forward half a dozen paces until he could place his hand on the shoulder-high desktop.
Now, he's all right, but he was going to lead an expedition into the Gobi. What I want to know is this. What are you going to do with the bomber?
Baron Suga permitted himself a smile.
First, I believe we are concerned with you. I find it in you a former Army officer who has committed an unfriendly act and is perhaps, even now, contemplating espionage.
The pilot stood straighter and his eyes hardened.
You can't get away with that. Look, you'll either return that bomber to me for shipment or I'll have your hide. Understand?
Speak softly, Mr. Ragen.
Softly? Hell! I'm delivering a bomber to the Chinese and I'm going to deliver it. That ship is worth $70,000.
The Baron shrugged.
It carries a useful load of 10 tons, has two 550 horsepower engines, and can fly 950 miles. What chance has our army if you hand such machines as this to the Chinese?
Clint Ragen had the appearance of a man harried beyond resistance. His eyes had receded until they were two blue slits, and his fingernails dug deeply into his palms.
Listen, China is buying her ships from reliable companies, and she's paying cash. You have a plane here you call the Kawasaki KDA-5. It is a copy of the Curtiss Hawk. You have another plane called the Nakajima 92, which is a copy of a French Marine.
What of it?
Just this. You're too damn dumb to build your own planes. You got to copy those of other nations. But China's shoes square with us. She pays us for our ships instead of stealing our designs.
Baron Suga's face deepened in color. His mouth fell open, exhibiting sharp teeth. Unexpectedly, he lashed out and slapped Clint Ragen across the face. But the pilot did not wait to see what else would happen. His fist soared up before the Baron's face could withdraw, and the Baron slammed back, lips spouting blood. Then a pistol butt caught the American on the side of the head, stunning him. Before he could recover, men were all over him, pinning him down.
Take him to a prison. Allow him to communicate with no one. You have insulted officers of Japan, Mr. Ragen, and soon you will discover just what that means.
They dragged the pilot out of the room and left Professor Simpson wringing his hands.
Oh dear, you won't. You won't.
No. If you'll promise us your silence, worthy sir, you will have your liberty.
Thank you.
said the professor, and tottered from the room, leaning heavily upon his umbrella. Clint Ragen was up at dawn. Not that there was anything to do, but he had been unable to sleep on the hard board and wooden pillow which constituted his bed. Clint Ragen had begun to appreciate the seriousness of his circumstances. He had heartily cursed himself for his outbreak before the aviation officers, but that did him no good now. The cell was not very big, but Clint paced what there was of it. The chances were against his getting to see the ambassador or even a consul. Clint was under no delusions as to the actual reasons behind the seizure of the plane. That sweet bomber would look quite well with the blood-red disk of Japan on its wings. In the eyes of international law, Clint Ragen was a gun runner, and appalling things happened to gentlemen who pursued that hectic trade. There were guns in those crates, late-model machine guns which were to serve as armament for the ship, and Japan's declaration concerning arms had been made while Clint was aboard that old-fashioned tub. So now, in short, Clint Ragen was as good or as bad as a criminal in the eyes of Japan, and subsequently in the eyes of the United States. But Clint's ponderings were interrupted by a light tap, a grate of iron on stone, and the whisper of cloth. Someone was coming down the corridor which led to the cell. Clint tensed, waiting, wondering what message might be forthcoming. Then he swore and sat back dejectedly on his wooden bunk. Professor Simpson was staring through the small window in the door.
Well?
Simpson removed his glasses, wiped them, put them back, and took a deep breath.
Good morning, Mr. Ragen. You do not appear to have spent a comfortable night.
Slept like a daisy.
I believe I have news for you. The officers have charitably offered you a compromise.
What's this?
Simpson coughed hollowly.
They are thinking of giving you a military court-martial.
Firing squad?
Well, not exactly. Perhaps that might be, too. But instead of that, they are quite willing that you should go free.
What's the joker?
You see, yesterday afternoon, they tried to put the bomber together. And as I understand it, they encountered some difficulty. The matter is a complicated one, I presume.
Complicated? All they have to do is pull it out of the crates, buckle on the wings, mount the motors, and fasten the props. I'm afraid you got him wrong, Professor.
No, I don't believe I did. It seems that there is some difficulty. I don't exactly understand it, but the motors won't fit the mounts.
Huh? They probably don't know when they're right side up.
Clint moved restlessly.
Well, what's that got to do with me?
Well, they asked me to tell you. They want you to put the to put the plane together for them.
Clint let out an explosive sound. His eyes flamed.
Oh, you mean they've got the crust to... Wait a minute. Let me get this straight, Simpson. They want me to fix up the ship they swiped off me? That right?
Yes.
Well, you can tell them for me that they can go straight to hell. I suppose they want me to buy gasoline for it, too.
The professor began to wring his hands.
But, my dear fellow, can't you see? Don't you understand that they will drop all charges if you will do this for them? I do not believe that you fully appreciate what you face.
Clint grated his teeth and started to swear, but suddenly he checked himself, eyes narrow, speculative.
All right. Go back and tell them that I'll be right with them as soon as they let me out.
I thought you would listen.
The aviation field was nearly the best Japan had to offer along such lines. Here, the inland sea and the jagged islands made flying a very difficult task, for emergency fields did not exist. The equipment was modern enough, and the hangars were large, but the runways were short and uneven. Bordered on each side by rice fields, the ground was soggy. A file of soldiers waited to take the foreign pilot into custody. They marched him out to the detached pile of segments which, when assembled, would be the bomber. Clint stopped short and snorted loudly. Professor Simpson, bringing up the rear, also stopped.
Tell them,
Clint said to the professor,
that they might at least mount the wheels on the fuselage before they try to fasten on the wings.
Simpson caught the attention of a young flying officer and passed the message along. Orders were rapped, and the half-braced wings came off, and the wheels started to go on. Clint stood by sullenly, watching the greasy mechanics swarm over $70,000 worth of plane. Then his professional pride got the better of him, and he pulled off his coat and waded in. With the landing gear attended to, Clint stepped back and told the professor the proper directions for mounting the wing. Simpson translated in a monotonous voice, leaning heavily on his umbrella, his gray hair rustling beneath his black hat.
If my chiefs could see me now, a firing squad would be tame. Oh, I'm mad enough to tear into this whole outfit.
I would strongly advise against it. There are several armed men in the immediate vicinity.
Clint stepped forward to help take a mighty engine out of its cradle. With his hands full of spare parts, he tried to point the motor's destination, but the mechanic stared blankly at him. Clint looked around for the professor, but that worthy, for the moment, had disappeared. The pilot shrugged and did the best he could with sign language. With engines 1 and 2 mounted, Clint stepped back to discover that the professor was again with him. He took the opportunity to outline the procedure for mounting a prop, and then, the minute Clint's back was turned, Simpson was once more gone. When the propeller was hubbed, the professor was back.
Damn! I wish you wouldn't do a Houdini every time I need you. What's the matter?
Simpson merely fumbled nervously with the binocular case and said nothing. The afternoon wore away, but each passing moment saw the bomber closer to completion. The motors were in place, the wings were on, control wires had been slipped over their pulleys, and Clint was adding a few finishing touches. 6 machine guns were now laid out on a strip of canvas, shining under the slanted rays of the departing sun. Clint carried a brace up to a cockpit and fastened them down upon their mount. A Japanese flying officer was all attention.
He wants to know how to load them.
Clint obliged. One of the boxes divulged a dozen loaded drums. Carefully, he inserted the belts and pulled them through the brackets.
Tell him,
Clint began, but looked up in time to see that the professor had once more disappeared. He scratched his head irritably and began to demonstrate at length in pantomime. With the guns all mounted, Clint climbed down and found Simpson again at his elbow.
That fellow,
said the professor, pointing to another flying officer,
is anxious to find out where you fill the gasoline tanks.
Clint nodded wearily as he saw a large fuel truck rumble up to the side of the ship. Hoses were tossed to the pilot, and one by one he filled the tanks amid the exclamations of the onlookers. They had never before seen auxiliary tanks in a ship's wing. Once started, Clint filled them all. An officer wanted to know exactly how the controls worked and exactly what all the meters stood for. With a sigh, Clint sat in the pilot's seat and demonstrated. The pilot looked around for his interpreter, but once more he found Simpson to be among the missing. However, he was not needed, for here was one flying officer who spoke an understandable brand of English.
You have been very kind,
said the Japanese pilot.
Now, would you please start the engines? I would like to know how that is done.
Clint started them one by one and sent their blasts rocketing about the hills of the inland sea. He pointed to the gauges which showed that the engines were warm. Then, letting them idle, he leaned back, tired from the day's work. The officer smiled thinly.
You have been very kind. Now, perhaps, we had better restore you to the prison.
The prison? I thought that...
Yes, but you were not right. We still have grave charges to press against you.
Clint sat up straight, and something in his eyes made the officer hastily draw a pistol from his belt. Then there came a shriek from the hangars and the sound of pounding feet. The officer turned, and over his shoulder, Clint saw Professor Simpson racing towards the bomber, umbrellaless, hatless, and very hard of face. To think was to act. Clint snatched the pistol from the officer's hand and slammed him in the jaw. He dumped the Japanese out onto the ground, reaching down with the same movement to help Simpson into the pit. But Simpson needed no help. He scrambled into the observer's pit behind. Clint fired twice at men who were trying to catch hold of the wings. 2 throttles went all the way down on their arcs, and the plane began to rumble forward, shaking in every section.
What the hell?
Clint started to shout, but a machine gun near the hangar opened up and the bomber took the air. Another machine gun started to bark, but this time it was just in back of the pilot's head. He turned for an instant to see Simpson fumbling with the loaded guns. Clint didn't know what possible trouble Simpson could have got into, but the bomber's wheels were off and the trouble didn't matter. Back on the tarmac, fighting planes were being rammed out and started. Without a good gunner to cover his tail, Clint knew he was in for a hot time of it. As quickly as possible, he built altitude and began to fly southwest. He watched the skies about him for the first signs of the attack he knew would come. Those Japanese pursuit planes could make close to 200 miles an hour, and the bomber was going top speed at 180. The 2 machine guns mounted in front of him were empty, but reaching back for drums, Clint quickly remedied that. He was hard put to keep his eyes open against the beating slipstream, and his hair persisted in whipping down over his face. And then a helmet plopped down beside him, and without asking questions, he put it on. And then the first Japanese Kawasaki KD-A5 plummeted out of the sky and sizzled past the bomber. Clint could hear the stutter of guns. Another plane shot down and came up again, tracer streaking through its prop. The guns in the observer's pit began to chatter. The interplane struts of the leading Kawasaki suddenly disappeared. Before Clint could grasp that miracle, the plane was spinning. It would get down all right, but in a very tattered condition. Another Kawasaki lanced by, but it was not firing. Clint could see the pilot jerking vainly at the loose stick. That fellow would also have a tough time bringing his ship back. A third pursuit ship zoomed past Clint's nose, and he pressed his trips. The prop went out in a shower of splinters, and the maimed motor began to shake loose from its mount. 3 ships, in formation, lanced out of nowhere, guns hammering, motors howling, wires screaming. They came like javelins, but before they reached the altitude of the bomber, the lead plane slipped harshly. Then the second skidded, and the third went into a spin. Clint's eyes bulged. Clint realized that darkness was settling rapidly. He could hear other motors, but he could not spot them, and he knew in turn that he could not be spotted. He sat back, relaxing, and began to worry about his destination. Without a navigator, even though the flight to Shanghai was only 800 miles, Clint did not know where he would end up. Besides, he was entirely too worn out for 5.5 hours of flying. Allowing for that and his lack of charts, he did not believe he could possibly reach Shanghai. It was a bad end to a glorious career. He'd go down in the Yellow Sea, and there wouldn't even be wreckage to mark his passing. He groaned to himself and wondered what in the name of all the Japanese devils had caused him to escape. There'd be a price on his head now. Some of those Kawasaki's had been crashed, that was certain, and even if the pilots hadn't been killed, the offense was great. A slithering sensation against his right arm made him look up. He saw that Professor Simpson had slid down into the front cockpit and was settling himself into the co-pilot's seat. Clint Ragen saw the small man begin to wipe his face with a handkerchief. He thrust the glasses into his pocket and ran his fingers through his hair. And then he pulled a small map and an octant out of his frock coat and snapped on the panel light. That done, he stood up and held the navigation instrument to his eye, writing on a pad. There was a sliding panel which closed in the cockpit, and Simpson drew this over, shutting out most of the engine's noise.
Fly 221 degrees,
Said Simpson in a crisp, clear voice.
That'll slam Shanghai right on the old nose. Allowing for drift, it'll take 5 hours and 45 minutes. If you're tired, old boy, I'll push her along.
Clint Ragen frowned. He was puzzled by the professor's use of slang and more puzzled by the change in his tone of voice. He turned and looked squarely, and what he saw made his eyes widen perceptibly. Professor Simpson's gray hair was now black. There were no lines on his face, and without them the expression was youthful and eager. Simpson looked very military and businesslike.
Just who the hell are you?
Clint asked, amazed.
Lieutenant Brandon, United States Navy.
But why the... Oh, I get it. You sure had me going for a while. I thought you were just what you said you were. You intelligence boys sure do run into some awful scrapes. I was in the Army intelligence over the Mexican border for a while.
But,
said Brandon, alias Simpson.
I'm afraid I led you an awful chase, with some bad risks. To get you out to the field to assemble the ship, I told them that they'd break it if they didn't know how. You see, I had orders to get photographs of a Japanese airdrome and the landmarks around it, and I didn't even think I'd better give it a try until they had your ship thrown over the side. That sure simplified things. I got some beauties of pictures.
He patted the binocular case. Clint Ragen looked at him and grinned.
Well, thanks anyway. I'd never have lived it down if they'd gotten this bomber. But I still don't see how they knew it was aboard the old tub.
No?
Grinned the Navy man.
One of our chaps tipped them off to give me a chance to get out to the field.